Thank you so much for joining us to celebrate Open Access Week and to celebrate it with a spectacular speaker who, besides his ordinary portfolio, has been an innovator and a leader in the field of library information science and innovation and intelligent uses of the internet for his years in the profession. We don't have to go into how many years. We merely need to tell you that Clifford Lynch is the executive director of the Coalition for Networked Information, and he's been in the field of higher education, leading us, showing us things that we never knew existed, almost before they existed themselves. The Coalition for Networked Information, known as CNI, is the organization he's led since 1997, and it's a joint sponsorship between the Association of Research Libraries and the organization known as EDUCAUSE. There are about 200 member organizations that are part of the Coalition for Networked Information, and twice a year, Cliff leads symposia through the coalition, bringing together information technologists, information scientists, librarians, interested higher ed specialists to think about interesting ideas as technology changes how we do business in this world. CNI's wide-ranging agenda includes work in digital preservation, data-intensive scholarship, teaching, learning, technology, and infrastructure and standards development. We are really thrilled to have Cliff here. I should say also that Cliff worked once upon a time at the University of California Office of the President, the last 10 as Director of Library Automation. He has a Ph.D. in computer science from the University of California at Berkeley, and he is on the faculty at the information school there. So he is not only an implementer of process and ideas, he is an innovator of ideas and teaches other people about innovation. I could go on, but I won't. His vita speaks for itself. I do want very much to thank Shuchen Sun and Kate Dowie and Salva Ismail and members of the library staff for bringing Cliff Lynch. And it's my pleasure to introduce him to you now. Clifford Lynch.
Well, thank you. Can people hear me all right? Okay. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I always enjoy an opportunity to talk with a campus community about issues in scholarly communication during Open Access Week. I think that's a time not just to think about open access, but really to think a little more broadly about what's going on in the overall system of scholarly communication. When we actually managed through considerable persistence on the part of your colleagues, Artemis, to find a slot that worked this week, they suggested that it would be very helpful for me to touch on some of the issues around tenure and promotion and how that interacts with issues around open access. And of course, there really, that begs the question of what are the linkages between quality of scholarship and open access and those kinds of questions. So I took a deep breath and said, yeah, I'd be happy to touch on that, but I'm going to have to do it in a somewhat episodic way because of two things. One, the issues are a bit different from the disciplines around, for example, the sciences, where typically the common unit of scholarly communication is the journal article, and many of the humanities where really it's monographic works that dominate. Those two worlds have taken a slightly different trajectory over the past decade, although they're coming back together in interesting ways. The other thing that's scary about this topic is that not only is the entire sort of academic evaluation process rather opaque at most institutions, I think. I mean, it is something that is the subject of all sorts of mythologies. secret tales told in hallways, and people saying, oh, you shouldn't do this because these faceless people will hold it against you, but you never really quite find out whether they do or not. So that's a problem, and then you can compound that with the phenomenon that I've never seen any two institutions that do it the same way. One of the really enlightening experiences I had, and if you're interested, I commend you the reports of this, was to serve on the advisory committee of an initiative that Mellon funded about probably 5 years ago now, at the Center for the Study of Higher Education at Berkeley. Now, to understand the Center for the Study of Higher Education, you need to understand that the person who was running the place had been provost at Berkeley, and then had decided to become provost for the entire UC system at the office of the president. And then when he retired from that, decided he would spend his remaining career as very senior administrators at UC do from time to time, studying sort of how higher education systems work. So this is a person with unusual insight into processes of things like faculty evaluation and tenure and promotion, having been a provost twice, and a department head before that. He got a bunch of money from Mellon to look at the interactions between faculty publishing choices and tenure and promotion, and to do it at Berkeley as a test in a series of disciplines, and then to expand it out to a number of other institutions and more disciplines. And they published some rather elaborate reports out of this, which were really extremely interesting. We had a couple of sessions at CNI looking at some of the outcomes of this, and the two key names are Judd King, who was the former provost, and a sociologist, I believe she is, named Diane Hartley, who worked with Kim on the studies. So, you know, one of the big, and he managed to enlist several past chairs of the Faculty Tenure and Promotion Committee at Berkeley to help with this. So this was, of all the studies of this sort I've seen, probably the one that had kind of best access to what was really going on behind the curtain. And it was pretty interesting because you got the strong feeling that faculty, and particularly junior faculty, believed that making choices that strayed from the straight and narrow were that action was much more dangerous than the actual tenure and promotion committee decision makers did. You know, you hear all these stories about people who did digital humanities before they got tenure and got killed for it, and things like that, or of people publishing articles in places other than the 3 flagship journals in their field and really getting penalized for it. And it turns out that junior faculty seem to get a lot more advice that this is going to happen than maybe is borne out in reality, at least at the institutions they looked at. And it is important to understand that there are significant differences among institutions, and there are significant differences also among the quality of faculty, and that can skew things too. I mean, I would just remind you of you know, the case of Perelman and the Poincaré conjecture. Some of you may know about this. So this was a young postdoc from Russia. And one of the things mathematics does that's very interesting is they make these problem lists of really hard problems. And some of them stay open for like 100 years. And there is broad consensus within the discipline that these are like genuinely hard problems, and if you solve one, you know, the heavens open and rain down money and Fields medals and $1 million prizes and things like that. You know, and your answering machine or the modern analog gets totally filled with offers for full professorships, places, and stuff like this. So this gentleman, who was, I guess, about 28 years old and a little antisocial, to be sure, went and solved this. And he was really just not very interested in writing it up. So he did a series of, I believe it was 3 preprints, put them into the math physics archive at Cornell, the one that Paul Ginsparg runs, and says, I'm done. I'm not going to bother submitting it to a journal and, you know, bickering with somebody about whether the proof's right. The proof's right, go check it yourself. And went on into semi-seclusion in Russia, declining various prizes. So, you know, if you're one of those sorts of folks, it probably doesn't matter very much where you put your work. And, you know, I think he stands as a very good edge case for that sort of thing. But for everybody else, it gets, you know, harder in greater or lesser degrees. So with all of those very lengthy caveats, let me just talk a little bit about some of the things that have been happening. And first, let me just talk a little bit about open access without getting too over-involved in the details. So the fundamental idea behind open access to scholarly publications is that these should be available to anybody who wants to read them freely on the internet. And there are a whole pile of variations of this. For example, there is a variation where there is a delay before they become publicly available. And that helps protect the extant publisher's business model, and is kind of a way of splitting the difference. So a lot of publishers now, particularly scholarly societies, open up their archives after 5 years. That's become fairly commonplace for a lot of journals. In other cases, there are shorter embargoes. Now, the funders have gotten into this, and I'll come back to that in a minute because it's important. There are a number of rationales advanced for open access to scholarly writings. One, which I think is very compelling, is that it opens up scholarship to the broader society that supports it. It brings more people into it. It reduces friction and allows knowledge to move more quickly through scholarly circles. It breaks down barriers between disciplines by allowing different disciplines easy access to each other's work. It does a lot of, I think, very valuable things. There is a second argument which has been advanced very forcefully that basically says that funders, and particularly governmental funders, underwrite a great deal of research that leads to these publications, and that to boil the argument down, you know, to its simplest terms, you as a taxpayer paid for this stuff. You ought to be able to read it. One of the most powerful places this plays out is in the life sciences and biomedicine, because you can translate this into very vivid human terms that folks in Congress and folks who vote for people in Congress can understand. So, you know, whining about the fact that you can't indulge your recreational interest in string theory, because you can't get the latest articles. Okay, that's a theoretical win, but contrast this to bringing in the, bringing in a mother to testify in front of Congress that her daughter has just been diagnosed at age 5 with type 1 diabetes. And she's trying to figure out what is the best medical care and way forward for her daughter. And she finds out that despite paying mountains of taxes, she can't get access to the most recent medical literature on this topic. And that just seems wrong when you look at the $30 billion a year or so that we put into the National Institutes of Health. And that's a compelling, clear argument. So the funders are showing up here as a factor too. It's not just, it's a good idea. This is taken on a political dimension. I'll flesh that out in just a couple of ways. In February of 2013 in the United States, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is the White House's sort of overall overseer of its science agencies, issued a directive that said basically that any agency in the federal government passing out more than $100 million worth of grants was directed to change the terms and conditions that were attached to those grants so that all outcomes of the grant, all research outcomes, were available for public access within a year. And that, in fact, is a directive that goes much farther than just journal articles. It covers, for example, data that is produced as part of the a grant from a federal agency. Those implementation regulations have been slow in coming. There were a couple of agencies who were already there, basically, or part of the way there before this directive came out, the National Institutes of Health being the most prominent example. The Department of Energy has issued its initial regulations in this area, and more are expected soon, but this seems to, for various reasons, have taken about a year longer than anybody expected to actually get these out. So one of the things that this means is that with regard to public access, open access to journal articles, at least delayed open access, is going to be not optional if the author is receiving federal grants. A number of private granteers are also on this. So, for example, the Wellcome Trust and the Howard Hughes Medical Foundation and folks like that are starting to implement similar rules in this area. It is not clear, I would say, at this point, what will ultimately happen in terms of books, monographs, and dissertations. They are not specifically included in the discussions right now, but I could readily see the same logic being extended there at some point in the future. That's purely speculation on my part. Similarly, organizations that fund the humanities heavily, like Mellon, have been, how shall I put it, they've had a much later touch in terms of open access, particularly to monographs that they fund. Although as a parallel matter, as part of their scholarly communications program, they are very active in trying to think about how we restructure the economics and dissemination of scholarly monographs in the humanities. But the approach there is one of trying to restructure a system as distinct from putting mandates on individual researchers. And actually, the agencies look like they're going to be quite nasty about this. As in, you don't get any more money from them if you don't deposit your journal articles and your data and meet the terms and conditions of their grants. The National Institutes of Health have already made themselves quite unpopular in certain circles in the last year as they've started following up and checking whether people actually deposited some of those journals that they would, journal articles that they would list on their progress reports back to the funders, and then decided not to dispense funding and more funding under the grant until they did. So this is a fairly serious matter and is worth understanding because it adds a whole separate dimension of compliance to some of this open access that is quite separable from the philosophic or tenure and promotion related pros and cons here. I would note that it has gotten even heavier in some other countries. For example, in the UK, they do a charming thing called the research assessment exercise. And actually, they've come up with some new acronym for the next one they're going to do. But basically, the idea here, in short, is that every faculty member puts in a progress report that every year that includes patents awarded, papers and books published, grants received, prizes received, and a few other odds and ends. And this is then aggregated up at a departmental level and even at an individual university level. Keep in mind that in the UK, universities until very recently have been almost entirely funded centrally by the national government. So you aggregate up this stuff and you basically crank it through a formula, and this is what determines funding at your university for the next 4 years. So if your research index numbers aren't high enough, they'll come by and say, you don't get any more faculty positions. In fact, we're going to defund some of the ones you have, and your math department just turned into a service department. We recognize we do have to teach some of the students here introductory calculus, but forget it, you're not a research department anymore. That's the kind of level of stakes that they're doing. And the Australians do it as well in a very similar way. What they have done in the UK is that they've announced after 2016, they are not counting any of those papers in the indexes unless they are deposited in an open access system. So, understand the dimension here that is about allocation of resources. Now, let's move on. Let me return just a little bit to definitions of open access. So let's talk about journal articles. There are basically a couple of ways you can make it open access. There are some journals that are just plain open access. Basically, they're available to everybody on the net. There's no subscription fee. They're subvened through the labor, volunteer activities, and contributions of someone. In some cases, it's libraries, for example. There are a surprising number of libraries around the country that are running things like the Open Journal system that essentially allow clusters of faculty at their institution to run journals off of that. And if the faculty are willing to contribute their time, it actually basically can run open access without a subscription model. At the other extreme, there are journals that basically are entirely open access but ask for an author processing fee. So they ask for, typically it's somewhere, depending on the journal, from maybe $500 to $5,000. It's a really big range depending on the journal. And they often have a whole series of special arrangements for people from the developing world or unaffiliated scholars or other people who don't have grant funds or institutional funds to underwrite this. But the journal itself is entirely public access. Then the third really important flavor you see here is standard subscription journals, and this includes, most of the big name journals, the Sciences and Natures and Proceedings of the National Academies and things like that, that they are still subscription journals in the way they have always been. And for example, here the library licenses access to that on behalf of the university community. You go through some authentication process, which if it's done elegantly is pretty much invisible to you, that confirms to Science or PNAS that you are a member of the Georgetown community and you get your access. But if you are just a person out there randomly on the internet coming in from Starbucks, unless you do something to come through or present credentials from Georgetown, you won't get access to most of that material. But what they're doing now is they're allowing you to essentially buy open access to an article you publish there. So instead of a fee for processing your article, it's a ransom for making your article open access. And again, the prices here vary a great deal from journal to journal. The outer bounds are probably, again, about 500 to 5,000, and most of it clusters more around 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. So that's an important development, and you do see faculty who choose to publish in those journals paying those fees. They often put them in grant budgets because they feel that it greatly increases the visibility and impact of their work, and because they have a commitment to widely sharing that work. And there are studies that present evidence that that work is more heavily cited than material that isn't brought out into the public, at least for the first few years, and other things. It's always a little hard to really analyze the effects of these kinds of decisions in a totally rigorous way, because every paper is in some sense non-substitutable and its own unique thing. But this is a pretty common practice and is another way of establishing open access. So let's talk about open access and quality relationships. In the early days of open access, there were assorted lies that were told floating through the various disciplinary communities that if you made your work open access, people would steal it. Not true very often. There have been a few incidents of that, but that also happens with the non-open access literature, where people just take your article and put their name on it. It's remarkable, but that does happen a few times every year. Many of the big publishers now actually are sharing a database behind the scenes where they match submissions to see if they're dealing with a case of this sort of thing, a little bit like the plagiarism detection systems that they use for term papers at some colleges and universities. But here they've got a much bigger database because it's basically all the big sci-tech publishers pooling material there. Okay, so another untruth that was very popular was that open access journals were inferior. They weren't peer-reviewed. That in some sense, open access was fundamentally inconsistent with peer review. I think the examples I've given, sort of demonstrate how insane that proposition is. I think the people at Science and Nature and PNAS and other journals that you're familiar with would be really interested to hear that they don't peer review anymore. Or that this is some particular signature of low quality. But nonetheless, one did hear these things, and I can tell you they're not true. I can also tell you, though, some bad stories. One of the other things that's happened is that you have seen the emergence of a set of what I'd characterize as junk journals. That have come out from nowhere. Many of them are based abroad, some of them in fairly exotic locales. Some of them have editorial boards listed on their website where none of the members know they're on the editorial board. And for a hefty fee, they'll publish almost anything and no one will pay much attention to it because nobody pays much attention to these journals. Basically what publish means there is they'll stick it on a website somewhere. So you do still want to think about what journals you're publishing in, and I think most working scholars have a pretty good sense of where are the legitimate journals. They may disagree on how you'd rank them, or disagree a bit on which audience you'd reach most effectively with which choice of journal, you know, within different subdisciplines, things like that. But I think my message here is that there is absolutely nothing that is inconsistent between open access and the highest quality and most rigorously reviewed, vetted, edited, and you know, otherwise vetted scholarship. You know, the world is full of examples that substantiate that. Now, I'd like to take on a couple of other questions here. One is that I think that open access and questions about open access have also gotten very mixed up, not just with quality, but with a much tougher set of questions about how to evaluate and how to, what weight to put on new forms of scholarly work that are emerging. And that's really a very different question than the question of, is it widely accessible? If you look at most journal articles today, yes, we move them around electronically, but you can print it on paper and it'll look like just like a journal article from 1950, except maybe we've tweaked the fonts up a little bit and color illustrations have gotten a little bit more commonplace in some journals. But you know, intellectually, there's no change there. You evaluate that article much the same way you would an article from 60 years ago. What we're seeing, though, is we're seeing scholars who are writing software, who are doing visualizations, who are doing large-scale simulations, who are curating data sets and analyzing them. And all of this is part of their scholarly work. And some of this is very time-consuming. And institutions everywhere are, and disciplines too, are struggling with, what do we do? How do we rate this new material? How do we understand it? How do we rank it? How does it compare to the most traditional modes of scholarly communication like monographs and traditional journal articles? And there are a lot of really hard issues around this. Everything from questions like fixity, you know, how do you evaluate a constantly evolving database? Confusions between effort and insight, and let me kind of give you a couple of examples of that. So once upon a time, back a couple, let's say a century and a half ago, you had people in fields like philology doing these hideous, not just dissertations, but life's works, where they do things like drag through Homer and write entire monographs on the use of a word in the Iliad, this sort of thing. And these were monumental tasks to do back then with the tools at hand, and very labor intensive, and actually at the time were viewed as substantive works of scholarship. From the perspective we have today, you would look at that and say, well, okay, I might have to keyboard the text, that's a nuisance. Hopefully somebody's already done it. And then this is a 15-minute, you know, programming exercise. And somebody got a dissertation for this or a professorship? You've got to be kidding. And you know, you could understand this level of effort gets confused with scholarly impact sometimes. And actually some of those things were very important as platforms for other people doing other kinds of scholarship. Now, today, particularly in the humanities, we're in a kind of a funny place because if you listen to people like Jerry McGann, they basically are arguing that we are going to need over the next generation to redo critical editions of most of our, you know, canonical texts that are designed for the digital world, that feature extensive markup and semantics and critical apparatus and things like that around it, that all of the things you can do in the digital environment are so powerful that we're going to see a whole rise of this kind of scholarly work again. And that kind of scholarly work used to get a lot of credit. It doesn't and hasn't in recent years generally. It is viewed more as compilation and less as analytic scholarship, which is very popular now in many of the humanities. If you look at, and there are legitimate issues here. If you look at another sort of poster child here, the work that Ed Ayers and Will Thomas did on the Valley of the Shadows. Basically, this was a study of the difference that slavery made in the, let's say, decade or so before the Civil War, that was undertaken by a tremendously detailed analysis of the economics, demographics, day-to-day life, commerce, civic structures of a couple of medium-sized cities and towns on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. And they relied extremely heavily on source documents like local newspapers, census, tax records, those sorts of things, to build this up. And they actually built this enormous factual database, which they used for years in their teaching. And they actually sort of pioneered a way of helping to teach students to use these as analytic tools. And you now see Will Thomas doing some sort of similar analysis at Nebraska of things like the effects of the movement of the railway system across the United States, particularly as it gets to the middle of the country on all kinds of social and economic structures. But in order to really make a difference with that, what they wound up doing was writing a tremendously lengthy analytic article that basically used that database as evidence. Basically substantiating every point they made in this lengthy article by links back to this database. Ed Ayers will freely tell you this was harder than any monograph he ever wrote, and he's won several that have won, all the major prizes in history. I think some people evaluating scholarly impact would focus very heavily on that article and the conclusions it reached, and would go much more lightly on the underlying organization of evidence that permitted them to write that article, that was in some sense, more mechanical and compilation oriented. You can see very similar kinds of issues showing up in the sciences, particularly when you look at the curation of things like databases in molecular biology, something like the Protein Data Bank or GenBank or something like that, where actually it is tremendously hard and complicated to build, care for, curate, and manage those databases. And nobody would argue that they enable masses of scientific breakthroughs, that we couldn't do science without them. But you still see a very serious kind of argument, which plays out among other places in tenure and promotion, about how to assess the work of the people who build those databases, many of whom started out as Ph.D.s in molecular biology or genomics or something like that. How should that rank against the analysis that it enables? So one of the places we've gotten really mixed up, I think, in this conversation is that the digital world enables a whole lot of new scholarly work and creates needs for new scholarly tools. And those are on the table in the discussion of evaluating faculty work, tenure, promotion, and things like that. Many of those tools and developments are in fact open access resources, but they're really, the argument is really much deeper, and it's about the nature of scholarship. It's not about open access. Yet these have gotten confounded often in the discussion. So I hope that that is a useful point of differentiation to hang on to. The last two things I want to say before opening this up for some conversation are, first, the funding agencies, again, are trying to argue for as open a view as possible of scholarly work and scholarly contribution. Those of you who have submitted grants to a number of the granting agencies know that they typically require these sort of short form CVs where you get to list your 5 most important papers, kind of thing, or the 3 other grants you've had that you felt had the greatest impact. So they typically have been asking for you to just highlight a few things that you believe are particularly impactful. Now what they've done on some of these agencies, and I think you're going to see more and more of this, is they're fiddling with the language. So it isn't about the 5 most important journal articles. It's about the 5 most important scholarly contributions. And specifically things like, I curated and made available for reuse and reanalysis this particularly critical data set or database. Or I wrote the code that does matching up of very short bits of sequences to reconstruct genomes, and it's now being, not only has my algorithm been validated, but it's in use in 100 labs around the world. These are now getting to be fair game for scholarly contribution in terms of things that the funding agencies are thinking about and taking to their review panels to help assess the qualifications of potential principal investigators. The state of these is much more ambiguous in local tenure and promotion decisions. I have no idea what the rules are here. I can guarantee you if you ask 4 other universities, you'll get 6 other answers. There is a definite shift in perspective, I think, that's starting to happen here and that will continue to roll out. But it is one that is very much framed by these disciplinary discussions about what really constitutes genuine high-impact scholarship in the fields. One hears a lot of talk about altmetrics. This is a snappy sort of word that's intended to describe other quantitative measures of scholarly output and impact beyond the sort of historic voodoo ones like citation counting and impact factors and things like that. And we could have a long conversation about what's wrong with most of those traditional measures and how they're being misused in ways they've never been intended. But leaving that aside, there's a lot of interest in various circles in these sort of altmetrics. Some people propose things like counting up blog posts and tweets and download numbers and things like that. And personally, I'm a little skeptical about some of this. But it's sort of an extension of this discussion of what genuinely constitutes scholarly contribution, and it's useful to understand that there's that discussion taking place kind of alongside. One of the characteristics of many of these altmetrics is they heavily favor acts that are carried out in public, whether they're tweets or blog posts or whatever, because they're out there to be counted and studied and computed upon in a way that the lockdown journal literature isn't. So that's worth thinking about. The last thing I'll just mention is this question of open access in the monograph. This is a really hard problem because while journal articles by and large translated into digital versions of paper pretty well. And I'm absolutely convinced part of the reason for that is because most journal articles aren't that long, so that you can print them on your desktop laser printer without killing 2 toner cartridges. And the resultant pile of paper is small enough to get a staple through or a paper clip around. If you have ever seen a digital book that you really wanted to read in detail in paper, I guarantee that for most of you, it was probably a miserable experience printing that out, going through 2 reams of paper, and then discovering there is no way to hold, the 2 reams of paper together, and it has this wonderful tendency to fall. So, that very practical kind of thing was one of the serious barriers here. Now we've seen a lot of progress in portable ebook readers. I think people are very split about those for scholarly work. And again, I've not seen a lot of rigorous study. I mean, one anecdotal thing I hear is that these are great for reading novels where I read very sequentially. They are not so good if I'm trying to read a more complex argument and I might want to refer back and forth or follow footnotes or compare passages or things like that, that the physical book still has a considerable advantage there. I believe that waiting out there to be fully discovered and understood are a number of models of what various kinds of scholarly monographs grow up to be in the digital environment. And they'll be very different than existing kinds of scholarly monographs. I don't believe we understand the shape of that. There have been extensive programs of experimentation funded by organizations like Mellon and Sloan, sometimes in partnership with people like the American Historical Association and some of the university presses. I think that's a very tough problem. And one of the things we know about open access right now is that it really relies to make plausible economics on being able to move the material around digitally. You probably aren't going to be able to do open access with physical printed books, where you just set up shops on street corners and give them away to anyone who wants them. I sort of don't see the way forward there. And so I think that the decisions around monographs are going to be trickier and more ambiguous for some time to come. I think what we're probably going to end up with in the short term is often a dual system where there's a limited print run which is used for presentation copies that can be thumped down on desks of deans, department heads, parents, other folks. But there also is kind of a backup system of open access PDF for people who want to get it through libraries that don't have a physical copy or just want to get to it on the internet and are highly motivated. But I don't think we've really worked out our business models or our content models around the monograph yet, and I think that's an important piece of the puzzle to understand for those in the humanities. So I know I've kind of bounced around here. This is, as I say, a kind of an episodic landscape with a lot of idiosyncrasy built into it. But I hope that, if nothing else, I've given you a sense of some of the current developments and pressure points and some of the interesting things that are starting to happen. I would be delighted to field questions, comments, arguments, or whatever. Thank you. The floor is open.
So I have a question. You were talking about the funding agencies that are not asking you for your 5 most significant publications, but rather your 5 most significant things, products maybe.
Yes.
Does that mean that Tenure committees and the scholarly world at large will be looking at impact more so than the actual object itself?
Well, I don't know what the tenure committees will do, and that would vary from institution to institution. But I can't help but believe that in the long run, these changes by the funding agencies will have some effect, because this is the information that gets put in front of the review and rating processes within the funders, the peer review panels and things. Now, how the peer review panels will, rank various things on there is itself a matter of some debate. But over time, I'm thinking that people who tell a compelling case about impact will tend to get more grants, and that will, if nothing else, will reflect well in the tenure and promotion process. That may be a 10-year cycle before you see much measurable impact from it. But I think it does, kind of throw down a challenge to the tenure and promotion groups within institutions to decide how they think about impact. And whether, counting monographs or trying to take a more holistic look at overall impact is the more appropriate thing to do. Yeah.
So Jerry McGann and Ed Ayers both relied on an army of graduate students in the Institute for Advanced Technology and Humanities and the E-Tech Center at UVA in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Jerry was already a university professor, and Ed was a full professor at the point that they started the Valley of the Shadow and the Rossetti and the Blake Archive.
Yep.
And I'm not quite sure what my question is, but let me see if I can get there.
Okay.
Wouldn't it be interesting to do a case study in academic anthropology on their students? I know of some, Matt Kirschenbaum, for example, who've gone on to have very successful careers and kind of doing alternative scholarship, and others who, I was a peer of theirs at the time in the English department there, others who had a lot more trouble, some people who decided to try to do digital editions and things like that had the same problem that traditional editions had. But it'd be interesting to look not only at Ed and Jerry's students, but at their students' students.
Correct. Yeah.
And just to see what the career trajectories have been and what their relationships with the tenure and promotion committees have been in their own institutions.
I've never seen a study like that. Anecdotally, you can ask them about their graduate students and where they ended up, and how that tracks with the acceptance in the discipline overall of various practices. But I have never seen that done. I think it would indeed be an absolutely fascinating thing to do. It might be even more interesting if we could do some of it comparing disciplines. I can think of at least a couple of other case studies. One is the movement to digital technologies and classics, the sort of thing that Greg Crane, for example, with Perseus pioneered. And I can remember talking with him a few years ago about this kind of acceptance matter, because classics is a very traditional area in some ways. And he said he felt that they had reached a bit of a turning point in this in very recent years, because they now had enough tenured people parked in different faculties in good institutions that they began to become a kind of a mutual support system for each other and each other's students a bit, in terms of reference letters and things like that. And it's not hard for me to believe that you might see a somewhat similar phenomenon as you track 2 generations out, say, from the initial cadre of graduate students who worked with those pioneer digital humanists. That would be, I mean, I'm thinking you might have a really interesting grant proposal there for somebody if you wanted to pursue it.
And,
Yes.
and just this is just a side note too, but of course, for Artemis' sake, just to point out that the role that the library had that Alderman had in supporting IAF too at that point in time, and again, just wondering what role libraries generally can have in continuing to push those boundaries and like we're doing right now, helping to further the discussion. So anyway, sorry.
I wanted to go back to your answer to Artemis's question about scholarly contributions. And I had not understood originally that meant impact. I mean, and it seems to me if you're speaking of impact, you're getting close to what you call the voodoo measurements that before. I mean, obviously it makes a difference in field, but even in subspecialties or things people are right now not interested in, but might be interested in, you know, it might be a foundation for something later. So the contribution impact is complicated, but I got a little confused.
It's very complicated and it is confusing, and the boundaries are not really bright lines. But let me try and facet out 3 different things here. There are people who have made discoveries, and actually, interestingly, a reasonable number of these are methodological to some extent. That have really changed the nature of a discipline and what it's doing. And sometimes those people don't, have really heavy publication records, or their contributions are in things that aren't publications, they're, GenBank. Yet, if you went round and you talked to leaders in the field and said, who's really made a difference? Their names would always come up. So that's one kind of impact, and that's an impact that I think, any properly run serious tenure and review process should get through the reference letters and things like that. If you're not getting that kind of input, I don't think you're really getting a full assessment of the person's role within his or her discipline and their scholarship. There's a second thing, which is there's a fair amount of scholarship that happens that is often very elegant, beautifully handled, but very, very specialized, and that very few people return to. Now, it's always dangerous to make decisions there on the short term because the world has a nasty way of surprising us. The most abstruse mathematical theories all of a sudden pop up in physics or epidemiology or someplace and become real important, and all of a sudden there are a lot of people interested in that obscure paper from 1941. But you do what you can, and it is clear that there is some beautifully executed and very rigorous, but very niche kind of scholarly work. Then there is the stuff that really scares me, where what happens is somebody thinks they can come up with a quantitative formula. So they go out and they get a bunch of citation counts, a pinch of salt, throw in the impact factors of the journals over some random period of time as an aggregate, and then come up with a magic index number that's supposed to characterize the value and or impact of someone's scholarly work. And I just can't say enough bad things about that. You know, it's intellectually dishonest. It's, you know, going to give you wrong results. It's, you know, really abdicating the responsibility of whoever's using it to do a legitimate and thoughtful evaluation of someone's scholarly work. So I was trying to sort of pull apart those three things. We had a question back here.
Yeah, so I want to go back to some of your comments on the OSTP memo, right? So there's a very real repository component of that and a technological component of how are we going to access these things and who's going to preserve and make it available long term. And I know there are multiple competing models out there. There's Chorus and there's Share. And I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on the real impacts that the repository decisions and the home of this content has on faculty.
Sure. I'll say a few things about that, although that's a pretty complicated and volatile landscape, but I'll do what I can to try and help a little. So first thing I need to be clear about is that the OSTP mandate to the funders deals with research outputs broadly. So this includes both journal articles and data. Now, for data, we have a, how shall I put this, exceedingly immature understanding of how to manage this, how to finance the infrastructure to perform preservation, where that infrastructure should be housed, and it's clearly going to be some mix of national, institutional, and disciplinary repositories, but we don't know what the exact mix is, how things move among them, where ultimate responsibility resides for long-term funding. I am of the opinion that we understand very little indeed about how to make long-term retention decisions in this area. So what we're doing now is actually setting ourselves up for even more trouble, because what a lot of people, a lot of investigators are doing now is they're saying, I'm going to keep this stuff for 5 years. I'll build that into my data management plan. I know how much that'll cost. It's easy to ensure it stays around for 5 years. And after 5 years or 7 or whatever the magic number is, they say someone will conduct some kind of magic process that will decide whether to keep it and who's going to keep it, and if so, make money appear for it. Doesn't sound too good, does it? As we start amassing all of these data sets, one of the things that Share should do, if it does at least what I hope it will do, is start developing an inventory of these and where they are and who funded the work, and hopefully how long they are funded for wherever they're parked, so that we at least have one of the databases we need to drive the scheduling of reappraisal exercises. But we don't understand the appraisal side either. So my view, personally, is that institutional repositories or aggregated institutional repositories, because you're also seeing those show up more and more, where a group of institutions will share a repository or do some kind of multi-tenant repository in the cloud with a layer of personalization to each institution. Those are going to be a vital part of the toolkit for managing the data side. Now, in terms of the journal side, I am actually, particularly in the sciences where the effects of the OSTP mandate are going to be concentrated. They're not going to be exclusive in the sciences. NEH is already starting to figure out how to deal with this, but the dominant area here is going to be science, engineering, technical kinds of material. We're actually in fairly good shape in preserving journals there. In the first place, we've got a number of independent systems like Portico and Locks, deposit arrangements with major national libraries. We also have some pretty large, well-funded, and competent commercial players in this area. I mean, in fact, you can make an argument that we were not as clever as we should have been when we started dealing with journal archiving strategies collectively, because we focused on things that were least at risk. The stuff that's really at risk is the very small, lightweight journals published by a couple of faculty members pro bono. I do not sit up nights worrying about Elsevier's back files disappearing, at the drop of a hat and surprising everyone. And actually, you might be a little bit surprised by how seriously Elsevier takes those kinds of things internally. I happen to know that they went through a very interesting planning process internally after 9/11, where they started considering what would be the effects of losing access to their material or losing authentication infrastructure around their material on research and indeed things like medical activity around the world, and plowed a lot of money into redundant data centers and things like that at that point.
And of a great level of satisfaction with this conversation. Cliff, as always, you're wonderful to listen to, and I think you've been very enlightening to all of us. And thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your questions. And indeed, please avail yourselves of the delicious refreshments that our staff has made available for you. Join me in thanking Cliff.